Welcome to part 3 of Unity 2D Basics. In this video, I'm going to talk about sprites and components. Unity has many built-in types of game objects. As a reminder from the first video, a game object is an entity as part of the model Unity uses of entity, component, and system. So there are multiple types of entities built into Unity, one of which is a sprite. A sprite is a 2D game object, so a game object for 2D games, that has a transform and a sprite renderer component. So in other words, it has a where to draw matching the transform and a what to draw matching the sprite renderer component. So let's put this in the mapping we did as part of earlier videos. So by default then, a sprite looks like this in our model. We have a sprite, which is a type of game object, and it comes with a rendering component, which again communicates with the rendering system, remembering that components are tuned to certain systems. So we want to start to think about 2D games. We have a sprite, which is an example of a 2D game object, which again comes with a transform, where to draw, and a sprite renderer, what to draw component. However, when we think about 2D games, we think about controlling them. So the thing we control on the screen in a 2D game is a sprite. And this is helpful because, again, Unity has a built-in game object of this type. When we control it in a 2D game, the sprite, the thing we control, has a position, so a where to draw, and it is drawing something, so a what to draw, but it also reacts to input. This is what will take us into multiple components as part of this video and into future videos. So we have a type of game object within Unity called a sprite, which again comes with two built-in components. However, if we want to move it, we're actually going to need to put what we think of as 2D game mechanics into the terms Unity understands. So remember, Unity is based on the entity component system model. So 3 different concepts here. So in Unity terms, what is going on in a 2D game is the input system sent events to some game logic that manipulated the rendering of the game object. So what we need then is more components. So far, we have a rendering component. But again, put in the Unity terms, we want an input system to send events to game logic to manipulate the position of the game object. What we want to happen then is to press a button and for something to move on the screen. But it's not necessarily as simple as that sounds. Again, we need multiple components because those components only talk to very specific systems. So if we want to render something, draw something to a screen, that's part of the rendering system. But if we want input is part of an input system, which means we will also need a matching input component. Then, if we want some game logic, some code to detect the events as part of the input system and react somehow as part of the rendering system, we're going to have to write some code, in which case we're going to need a third component. So far we have a rendering component, which is a sprite renderer, and we'll look at this in Unity momentarily, but we do not have an input or a behavioral script component, which is what we're going to talk about as part of this video. So we need to add those. Let's start in order. So we have the rendering component. We need 2 more. We need an input component, again matching the input system, and we need a behavior script component, what we'll call our game logic, which will direct when we get an input and what to do about the rendering. Introduced as part of Unity 2019, there is a new input system, hopefully named Input System. This allows users to create their own events. This is incredibly helpful for us based on named possible input. And we'll see what this looks like momentarily. But we have to enable it as part of Unity 2020. It is within the system and is recommended, but it's not enabled by default. So let's move back over to Unity and go through these steps. So I've mentioned it right here. To enable it, we need to go to Window, Package Manager. We're going to find Input System, and then we're going to click Install to begin this process. So let's move over to Unity to start the process of enabling the input system so then we can get the input component. So again, moving over to Unity. So okay, I'm over here in Unity. The steps were to go to Window, then Package Manager. Then we need to make sure right here, packages are part of the Unity registry. This is part of the Unity registry of packages. Sometimes by default it may select in project, but we want to make sure Unity registry is selected. Then we want to scroll a little bit and we want to find input system. Again, it's alphabetized or sort by name, so alphabetized here. So we're looking for I, input system. I already have it selected right here. And notice this is verified. This is part of Unity Technologies. It's right within the Unity registry. So we want to click install right here. And then we need to give it just a moment to install everything. And then it's going to give us a prompt when it's finished. And it's going to say, hey, do you really want to do this? And we're going to click yes. And by using this new input system, we can't use the previous system used within Unity. And it's about to tell us that when it finishes. So sometimes this can take a minute or two. So as we're waiting for this, there it goes. Now it's resolving packages. Again, it can take just a moment. So it set it all up, and now it's going to import all of that into our project. Which again, can take a little bit, depending on what else is going on. But notice though, we have currently what it's doing and its progress, and of course it's taken about 27 seconds as I say these. So again, it can take a little bit of time to do everything, but we need to be patient and make sure it's done. But once it's imported, we won't have to do it again, and it will just be part of our project. So again, this can take a little bit of time, but we want to go ahead and let it do its thing. So as a review then, what we want to do, and I'll move back over the slides and then we'll come back here in just a moment. What we want to set up is a system where we have this, right? We want two components as part of our sprite. And again, we'll add the sprite and talk about it here in just a moment. But we want a rendering component, which will talk to the rendering system. And we want an input component, which will get input from, talk to, the input system, which is what we were currently installing just now. So again, it can take a little bit of time for it to do that. But our goals here, and we'll walk through this in Unity once the input system is set up, is we want to add a sprite. Then we're going to add what it should draw, remembering that a sprite has two built-in components, a transform, where to draw, and a sprite renderer, what to draw. We need to handle the what to draw too, which we'll talk about here in Unity. But we want to move to this. And then finally, we want to move to a third component, which we'll talk to as we get to it. So let's go check in on Unity and see how it's doing. I believe it's now finished. Ah, yes. And this was the warning I mentioned. So this is letting us know that if we move to this new input system called input system, we can't use the previous one. And we're going to click yes. And then it's going to finish its importing, which again, we'll be patient, let it do its thing. It's going to now reboot Unity because it needed to reload everything. So while that's going on, let's again look at this right here. We've got our sprite, which we'll add momentarily. We want our rendering system, which we'll talk our rendering component. Then we want to have our input system, which we were just setting up, going to talk to our input component. So what we want to get to is a place where we have both of these systems talking to these both components. Then what we want to do is move to a system where we have rendering and input, and then we'll add the game logic. So I'm going to go ahead and talk through these steps while Unity is loading in the background, because sometimes it can take a little bit of time for Unity to load. We want to be able to do all of these steps one by one by one. So as I talked about, our goal is to create an input system that sends events to game logic, which then manipulates the position of the game object. We want to, in other words, press a button and move a thing. So, in order then, as we were just setting up our input system, we would have our rendering, our input, and our game logic. So let's talk about the game logic again as Unity is loading everything back up. So by default, again, a sprite does not know how to act. It only comes with the two components I mentioned, transform, where to draw, and sprite renderer, what to draw. In Unity, we give it a script. This is a set of instructions. This is code we give it that tells us what to do when certain things happen. This is a behavioral script component. We are telling it to do certain behaviors when certain things happen. In other words, when certain events happen, again, events are how information moves from systems to components. So when certain events happen, do certain things. As a final review, remember, Unity is based on the entity component system model. Again, just coming back to this. Game objects are sent events. Their components are sent events from systems. We write then game logic, behavioral scripts, that wait for those events to happen and then manipulate component properties. As a reminder from the second video, we have game objects, components, and properties. Properties are values of components. Components are within those game objects. So let's check in on Unity while we're sitting here. So Unity then has finished booting up everything up and is refreshing the packages as we just left it. So again, took a little bit of time, but it's okay. Notice down here, Unity registry, and we've got everything set up. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Okay, let's talk about doing this in Unity. I kept talking about this sprite thing, and I mentioned it's a 2D game object. Well, remember, as I talked about in the second video, Unity, and especially its user interface, is designed entirely around the entity component system model. So by understanding that model, again, we can understand not only how Unity works, but how to navigate its different structures. So let's start then by over here in the hierarchy view. Over here, I want to add a game object. Now, in Unity, there's often multiple ways to go about something. If I want to add a new game object, there are two general ways I could do that. One, over here in the hierarchy view, I could click this little plus symbol right here and go down to 2D object and find sprite. Or if I click out of that, I could also, with over here, go to game object, 2D object, sprite. Again, multiple ways to do things. I'm going to go ahead and click sprite. Notice it added a new sprite, a default name, to the hierarchy view. The hierarchy view is a listing of all entities, game objects, within a scene. As a reminder from the second video, we have projects, which have scenes, which have game objects. And we then work with assets, which we're going to get to very shortly, working with those game objects. So, this is our current scene. Notice up here the tile sample scene. As I mentioned in the earlier video, it defaults to sample scene. So project, scene, and then what we're working on right here. So when I added the new game object, new sprite, it automatically opened it over here in the inspector view. Again, as a review, the inspector view shows the current components of that game object. So with new sprite over here selected, it opened up its components. I mentioned it comes with two built-in components, which are transform, again, where to draw, and sprite renderer, which is what to draw. There's something important to notice right here. In sprite renderer, it says sprite, which is one of its properties, and then it says none, and in parentheses, sprite. So it doesn't know what to draw. It knows where to draw it, which is its transform, its position at 0, 0, 0, but it doesn't know what to draw. So let's talk a little bit about working with assets. So what we need to create now is something for this sprite to draw. Now we could import in an image or work with that, but Unity is prepared for us to do very basic shapes. So what we want to do is, again, there are always multiple ways to go about things in Unity, and I'm going to show one of them. Down here in project view, this little window right here, project, we want to add a new asset because we work with game objects using assets as part of a scene within a project. So again, multiple ways to go about this. Over here, when I showed the hierarchy view, I clicked on the little plus with the drop down. I could also do it right here, plus with a drop down, and it opens a ton of different options of things I could add as possible assets. Clicking out of that, I could also left click and do the same thing over here with create. So left click create is the same as the plus drop down. So I'm going to right click create. Then we've got all of these different options. Well, I'm going to come down here to sprites and over here to square and click. And then I'm going to click any out of this and accept its default name of square. And notice it filled in. So if I select within the project view square, which is a new asset we've added, notice over here it says square texture 2D import settings, and it lists more components as part of this. Well, I don't really want to get into this right now, other than to note right here pixels per unit is 4. So it's set up to do 4 pixels per unit, and it is a square. Also notice down here it says assets/square.png. So this is a very simple square image it's created for us. In fact, down here in the preview we see this is a 4x4 RGB A8 image. So I'm going to click out of this to deselect from the inspector view. Over here in the hierarchy view, I'm now going to select new sprite to select its components over here in the inspector view. Now I'm going to do something that we very commonly do when we develop within Unity, which is to say we have an asset as part of the project view and we drag and drop it from the project view into the inspector view. This is a very common activity, and we need to get used to doing this when we develop within Unity. So with new sprite selected and it showing up over here in the inspector view, I'm going to drag and drop square into sprite right here. Notice my cursor changes to the plus symbol right underneath it. When I let go, we now see square is the sprite to draw within the inspector view. And also notice something right here. Our systems changed. So remember, the model is called Entity Component System, but Unity presents it as Entity left-hand side, Systems in the middle, and Components over here on the right-hand side. Now that we've given it what to draw, again, Sprite Renderer is what to draw, we have something we can move around within the scene. So a scene shows us the things we have within the hierarchy view right here. And if I click on this, I can drag around this now white square anywhere I want within the scene. Notice as I do that, over on the right-hand side within the inspector view, its position is changing. So where to draw changes corresponding to where I'm dragging it around. I'm going to let it go right here. So we finally have something to render. As part of the rendering system, then we have a transform, where to draw, and a sprite renderer, which finally now has something of what to draw. So we can complete that first step of the components we needed. And in fact, let's go back and review that just so I can show it. So as we set up right here, let's go back and look at the different things we wanted. We wanted to start our rendering component. Then we wanted to move into the input system. And we actually started with that because, again, it took a little bit of time, and then we walked through the slides. So let's loop back here and talk about it. We now have rendering component all set up. We need to move on to the input component. So let's move back to Unity and finally put the input system into play. So, okay, moving back over here to Unity, I want to add a component to new sprite, which is, of course, a game object. Again, as I will say very often, there are multiple ways to do things within Unity. Just like I showed with the hierarchy view when we were adding game objects, there were two different approaches. Down within the project view, working with an asset, there were two different approaches. There are also at least two different approaches for adding components to a game object. One way we could do it is with, over here, the object selected within the hierarchy view, we could go to component and select the system we want, or with it selected over here and the components showing up within the inspector view, we could go to add component and select what we want. I'm going to right here go to add component and then select what I want. So what I want is something called input and player input. Right here, this is the new type of component we added as part of the new input system. This would not have shown up unless the input system was enabled. I'm going to go ahead and click on this. Notice right here it says, okay, you've added a player input component as part of new Sprite, but it says there are no input actions associated with this input component yet, and it says click the button below, which we'll do momentarily. And then notice it gives us a bunch of other information here. So what we want to do is click on Create Actions. Then it says over K, where do you want to save these actions you just created? So this is going to be an asset we're creating that will have the settings of the actions we want. This is part of that named possible input I talked about significantly earlier in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and save this right here as component example. It will save within the assets folder, and I'm going to click save. Once I do, notice it shows up down here as part of component. So new Sprite generated this right here. Just like what we did for dragging and dropping Square from the project view into the inspector view, we're now going to drag and drop the action asset we just created into the actions property. So selecting right here, dragging and dropping right here. Notice now it's set up. There's no error given right here, and we have right here component example input action asset. We have a default scheme of any player map or default map of player. So the other thing we want to set up right here is how this will work. So notice right here it says none input system UI. Let's go ahead and click on this. Make sure none is selected. Then we want to, okay, what should happen right here? For behavior, what we want is we want to send messages to GameObject. That's exactly what we want, again, following this. So let's open input settings. So right here, we have our settings set up right here, and close this. And we're just double checking everything. So I'm going to double click this, and it opened on another screen, so I'll drag it over. So this is what I talked about as part of the named possible input. This seems like a lot of information, but this allows us to define certain events we want to happen as part of the input system. So, for example, we have player, which has move, look, and fire as primary verbs of what the player does. If we open up the drop-downs here, these make slightly more sense to us. So what we want is anytime move happens, so the move event, we want it to be triggered by either the left stick of a gamepad, WASD, an XR controller, so if we're part of virtual reality, or as part of some joystick. Whenever any of those things happen, trigger the move event, we'll give it over here the property of a value using a vector 2, which we'll talk about more in future videos. So let's then look at look. Same thing. Whenever look happens, so the right stick on the gamepad, or with the pointer using the delta, so as the pointer moves around as I'm doing right now, or if they're the hat switch on a joystick, or for fire, the same thing. Except now these are buttons. And again, we'll talk about this more in a future video. So we have 3 different possible events that can happen. A move event, a look event, or a fire event. Again, coming back to the named possible inputs I talked about much earlier. So we have this set up as the possible things that can happen with the player. They can move, they can look, or they can fire. So we have all of these set up now. And I'm going to finally close this. So our new Sprite then finally has the 2 things we want. I'm going to move back to the slides for just a second. So we have then an input component and we have a rendering component. Now let's finally close out this video with the very last thing we need, which, as we talked about, is a script component. So what we want to happen is this. So we won't get to this writing the code within this video because it's already rather long. In the next video, we're going to directly talk about using code to do this. But this is what we want to happen. We want a rendering component that talks to a rendering system, an input component that talks to the input system, which we configured in this video, and then finally now we're going to add some game logic as part of a behavioral script component to this sprite. Then we'll write the code in the next video. So let's finally close this out by moving back to Unity. And again, there are at least two ways to do things within Unity. I want to add a new script component to new sprite. Again, selected right here, new sprite. I could go component and then go down to scripts and add things. Or I could, with it selected, come down here, add component, which I'm going to do. Down here to new script, click on this. It says, what do you want to call it? I'm going to accept the default name of new behavioral script. Tell it to create and add. Now, two things just happened. Well, actually, there it goes. Two things just happened. Sometimes got to give Unity just a moment. Two things just happened. We added a new behavioral script component. It is a component right here as part of the sprite. Right here in the hierarchy view and selected, I'm looking at inspector, new behavioral component. And we generated a file over here, new behavioral component, or new behavioral script. So we have a new component as part of the sprite, and its name is new behavioral script, which is in C# code. So we finally have everything ready to actually do something in the next video, which I know is a little frustrating, but we needed to talk through everything within this. So let's go back and review something I talked about by looking at this slide right here. In Unity, there are built-in game objects to help us with common tasks. One example of these is a sprite. A sprite is a 2D game object that comes with two built-in components. It has a transform component, a where to draw, and a sprite renderer, a what to draw component. When we think about 2D games, we want to be able to press a button and move a thing on screen. We want to actually build a game. To do that, though, we needed to start to add more components to the existing sprite. So we added a sprite game object to the hierarchy view as a game object. Then we needed to tell the sprite renderer component within the sprite what to draw. So we got to work with an asset. Remember in the second video, I talked about there are projects, scenes, which are a subset of things within a project, and then there are assets which we use to work with game objects. We created a simple sprite asset of a square, a simple 4x4 square. We then dragged and dropped from the project view into the inspector view the asset we created. This associated them and gave the sprite renderer something to draw. So finally we were fulfilling the where to draw transform component and the what to draw sprite renderer. Then we moved into talking about the input system. Again, added as part of Unity 2019, the input system allows us to generate named possible events. We added the input system. This restarted Unity once we agreed to it. Then we moved back in and added input, player input as a new component. We then clicked on create actions, which created a new asset of the configuration file. Then, just like the square, the image asset, we dragged and dropped as part of the sprite renderer, we drag and dropped from the project view into the inspector view the settings file we created, which set everything up. Then we went down and checked the settings, which I'll move back just so we can see it. We opened the input settings and we double checked everything, and then we double clicked on this file to look at the input systems and talk through the 3 possible types of events: move, look, and fire, and how they're associated with. Again, we'll talk about this more in the next video. Finally, though, we added the very last component we needed, which was a new behavioral script component, which created a new behavioral script C# file. Again, we'll write code in the next video. That finally got us to the place we had been trying to get to this entire video, where we have 3 components as part of a sprite. And in the next video, we will finally be able to press a button and move a thing through working with multiple systems. A rendering system talking to the rendering component, an input system talking to the input component, and finally some game logic which acts as a script to guide the behaviors of the sprite. Lots of things going on, and we're going to finally get to code in the next video. Thanks for watching.